Part of what OM has done for thousands over the years is being able to give them some basic training and put them in a situation where they can actually practice that and find out, yes, I can do this, make a few mistakes, but you learn from it, and God can use, again, that effort.
Today's first-person guest is the president of Operation Mobilization in the U.S., Andrew Scott. Welcome, I'm Wayne Shepherd, and I look forward to introducing you to Andrew on this edition of First Person. In addition to what you'll learn in today's conversation, you can learn even more about OM and its mission of reaching the most marginalized and least reached people in the world with the gospel of Christ. Just visit our website, firstpersoninterview.com, and follow the links to Operation Mobilization. That's firstpersoninterview.com. And while you're at the website, be sure to take time to listen to any number of past interviews, which you may find interesting. Click on the Listen button for the complete list of past audio files at firstpersoninterview.com. Founded by George Verwer when he was a college student many years ago, Operation Mobilization is an international mission organization which is all about taking the gospel to the world. Here in the U.S., the president of OM is from Ireland. His name is Andrew Scott, a man who has served with OM for many years, as you'll learn. I visited with Andrew in his office near Atlanta, and I began by asking him how he ended up in the U.S. when he started out life in Ireland.
I've been asked that question many times, as you can imagine, but I guess the number one reason would be, of course, that a sense of God's leading. But that happened through an invitation by the former president of OM here in the U.S. After meeting me, he invited me to come across and help them start the recruiting of college students in the U.S. So I came across 10 years ago Actually, I was living in Northern Ireland at that time.
But you come with lots of experience with OM and on the ships, right?
Yeah, I spent 7 years total on the ships, 2 years as a single back in 1988 to 90, where really God got a hold of my life, radically changed the direction of my life, and gave me a heart for the nations. And after that, I went home, got married. I had a childhood sweetheart that we'd been dating through my ship experience, and then did my theological training, pastored in a church for 3 years, and then came back to the ships again for another 5 years with my family this time. Something my wife told me she would never do. Somehow God was able to convince her.
Yeah,
absolutely, yeah.
Well, I want to talk about that heart for the nations that God put in your heart. But take me back to the very beginning. When did you come to Christ? And talk to me about your childhood.
Yeah, my parents were very, very godly people. My father was the elder in the church, the only elder actually, and a little small Baptist church. And they, from a very early age, taught us the truths of Scripture. We had a Good News Bible Club, CEF Good News Bible Club in our house every Tuesday night. And from being in church, being in that, I understood very early on the need to accept Jesus as Lord and Savior. And so at 5.5, it was actually my older brother, that asked me if I'd ever done that. And I hadn't, and he led me to Christ in our bed. So that was at 5.5 years old.
That's remarkable. Sometimes it can go the other direction. When you're in a home like that, you turn and become a prodigal. But obviously that didn't happen with you.
But I have 3 siblings, and each one of them came to faith at an early age and has stayed the course, been involved. My brother's in full-time missions. My 2 sisters are very involved in the church. And I believe the faithfulness of my parents in a very, very sure way God has blessed them. And I know that's not always the case, and there's other directions for sure, but in our case, I see that as God's hand.
So was OM always sort of out front for you? Did you always know about OM?
Well, in Europe, OM is much better known than it is in the U.S. George, of course, moved across there back in the early 60s.
George Verwer.
George Verwer, yeah. And he... Actually, part of the reason was he didn't want it to be an American movement. He wanted it to be a global movement, and so he moved to Europe. And so OM, when I was growing up, OM was, to a large degree, the mission of choice for young people. And so my parents had an OM map on the wall. We had the Operation World.
You didn't stand a chance.
You hadn't a chance. And my brother ended up going before me. And so all of these things had influences on my life, obviously.
Yeah. I just want to pick up on George making it more of a global ministry. That was ahead of its time in its thinking, wasn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, George, like a number of his peers of that time, Lauren Cunningham and Bill Bright, and these men were visionaries. They were ahead of their time for sure. And he realized that the to reach the nations, it's going to take the nations, and that was a driving force from the early days.
Okay, so take me to that first assignment when you put your name on the dotted line with OM and you said, "Yes, Lord." What did you end up doing?
Well, it started with what we call summer campaign back in those days. That was just like a short-term trip. It was a 1-month trip into Italy.
How old were you?
I was 19 years old. I had never been out of the UK and just once out of Northern Ireland. So this was a huge change and shock on many levels, but an opportunity to get away from being in a very sheltered environment in my church and in my home, and just seeing God use me for the first time. But I think the bigger change came when we moved on to the ship and flew to Hong Kong. And you can imagine what that was like for a young Irishman who had never been really out of the country to land in Hong Kong and to join a ship with 300 people from 40 different nations.
Are those memories fresh?
Absolutely.
And what were some of those early lessons?
Well, I think one of the abiding lessons that stuck with me throughout my life, because I flunked out of high school. I was doing well in high school, but I worked part-time as a butcher, and my boss unfortunately offered me a job and before I'd finished my finals, and I ended up taking that job because as a teenager I knew everything I needed to know in life, of course, and made that decision that I could earn money quicker this way. And so here I was now stepping out of that, going overseas to be a missionary, and I realized I just was holding my hands in the air saying, God, how can you use a butcher? And probably, I think it was my second port in Manila, being able to go out onto the street and lead my first person to Christ.
Oh, wow.
And just understanding then that God can use anybody if we're just willing to make ourselves available.
Did you do that willingly? I mean, I know you did it willingly,
Yeah.
but were you frightened to witness on the street that way?
There was a degree of intimidation. These are people this was the Philippines. Would they speak English? Would I be able to get the message across? Would they even receive the message? All of those fears came up, but that part of what OM has done for thousands over the years is being able to give them some basic training and put them in a situation where they can actually practice that and find out, yes, I can do this. Make a few mistakes, but you learn from it, and God can use, again, that effort.
I would imagine that it's a lot of hard work on board the OM ships. I mean, what were some duties that you had while on board?
Well, for some reason, when I went there, they correlated the fact that I was a butcher with the possibility that I could cook food. So they made me one of the cooks, and I've never understood that, but I thoroughly enjoyed it. And so we would cook, meals for over 1,000 meals a day on board the ship, and so that was quite a.
And that would have been the doulos, right?
Yeah, the doulos. Yeah, I spent 7 years on. So those were, of course, with very short notice being told, now you're going to a prison today to share the gospel with prisoners, and assignments like that were just dropped on you at short notice, but just continually stretched you and give you opportunities that you never would have gotten. I never would have gotten back home in Northern Ireland.
What were some of the other ports of call?
Well, we spent most of our time in Southeast Asia. So I've been to about 65 countries. Most of those are been on the ship. So Southeast Asia, right as far north as sort of Korea and China, and across to East Africa and the Middle East. So that whole area, I've been to most of those countries.
Okay, so you said you did that for a couple of years as a single man. Yeah. Pick up the story there. What happened?
Well, I'd been dating my wife Sharon for 5 years before I went. We started dating.
But you went off on a ship somewhere.
Yeah, exactly. When there was no email, phone calls were really expensive. So we had a phone call once a month and letters. But we stayed true. And when I came home, we got married about 9 months later, knowing that the call was to go full time. And so Bible college was the next. I needed to do college, and so I did my theological training in Belfast. And but with the sole intent of going to the nations again.
You always knew you were going back.
Going back. And because I had seen the unreached and the fact that so few were going. And the two things in life that I'd said I'd never do was, one was go to Bible college, because that was a waste of time when people were going to hell every day. Why would I be sitting studying the Bible when I knew more than enough to tell them how they could have a personal relationship? God took me there realizing I needed further education. Secondly, I'll never be a pastor because there's too many of those and not enough missionaries. And God called me to the pastorate for 3 years as associate pastor in a Baptist church in Ireland. And that was a very, very important formation time for me, understanding the central role of the church in God's plan for the nations.
Yeah, I was going to say, as you look back on it now, you can see, as we all look back and see how God prepared us for what we're doing to follow His calling now. He always prepares us.
Absolutely. Yeah, I came away understanding the key role of, before I was evangelism, and then it was through the church, the understanding of discipleship and embedding them in the local church. And of course, then the central role, as I said, the local church in God's, that it is the primary instrument for reaching the nations.
But after the pastorate, you and your wife together...
And my 2-year-old daughter, we had a 2-year-old daughter at that stage. Right. We got the letter of invitation to come back. And interestingly, God brought my wife to the place of saying this is the right thing to do before I got there. But together we went in 1998 back to Doulos again.
Okay. Let's hit the pause button on your experience and talk to those listening who maybe feel a call of some sort on their life to do something like what you're talking about that you've spent your life doing. Well, what does that feel like? What does that look like when you begin to feel that move of the Spirit?
Probably a couple of things that I've experienced in my life. One, of course, is that sense, that inner sense that God is stirring your heart, and it's done that in at least a couple of ways with me. One is your current environment. I talk about what the eagle does to the young eaglets, and she takes all the fluff and all the nice things out of the nest when it's time for them to fly, but they don't want to fly. Makes it uncomfortable so that they don't want to hang around. And God has done that a few times in my life where it's been an unsettling and an unrest. And okay, God, what is next? And I go after seeking His will and His voice in my life. But then that deep burning passion inside, whether it's for a particular people group, a country of the world, or just simply the unreached or the marginalized, whatever the case may be, God is stirring your heart. And I always enjoy those times because there's this sense of anticipation of God showing the way, and also a heightened awareness of His presence because He's speaking into your life in that way.
We'll continue talking with Andrew Scott and learn more about Operation Mobilization coming up in just a moment on today's edition of First Person. One thing we talked about last year on this program was the Freedom Climb, a group of women focused on the plight of at-risk women and children, those who are exploited, enslaved, oppressed, and trafficked. Well, in a few months, Operation Mobilization Women will tackle climbing one of the peaks on Mount Everest to raise support through the Freedom Climb, and you can help. Just visit firstpersoninterview.com to learn more about the Freedom Climb and what you can do to support them with your gifts and prayers. Look for the link to the Freedom Climb at firstpersoninterview.com. My guest today on First Person is Andrew Scott, who is president of Operation Mobilization USA. Now, how does that fit into OM Worldwide, Andrew?
Well, we have work in 118 countries around the world, and each of those fields make up what we know of as OM, or the family of OM ministries. And every one of our fields is autonomous, but we are joined together with a common agreement to really serve one another for the purposes of making Jesus known among the unreached and marginalized.
How many full-time missionaries with OM?
We have 6,100 currently in
6,100?
Yep, in 118 countries, yeah.
That's incredible. Yeah. I knew it was a large... I had no idea it was that big.
It has grown. I think George Verwer had no idea whenever he first started it, too. Yeah.
You know, I worked at Moody Bible Institute for many years, and George would come and speak, and we would talk together, and I would hear the stories of George as a student at Moody, because some of the men I worked with, of course, were in the dormitory with George, and saw that fervor and passion in George early on in his life.
Yeah, it's amazing. And, you know, of course, when he started OM, it was simply to mobilize people through short-term experience into long-term work, but with other organizations.
Right.
But obviously, people wanted to be around George, and they stuck with him until today.
Yeah. Getting back to your story, I assume you got out of the kitchen on the ship eventually, right?
Yes. I got out of the kitchen, and of course, you know, went back home to Ireland and got married to my childhood sweetheart. Did my Bible college training and went to the church for 3 years and just had an amazing time there. But then got the invitation to go back to the ship, where I spent 5 years as one of the leaders on board to developing what we did for the people on board. It was called the Internal Ministries Coordinator. So our Bible study courses, our leadership training, ministry skills training, Even the school came under me, which I always smiled. The school for the children. I thought if my school teachers knew that I was now the principal of a school, they would laugh. But anyway, but that was an amazing time of just, again, seeing the world and seeing what God's doing throughout the world.
Talk about the ministry of the ships today.
The high-profile aspects of the ministry is the book shop on board, and that is really one of the things that gets us into a lot of countries, which is an excellent doorway in where people are looking for educational material. And so we have, I think it's 10,000 titles on board, and people come up the gangway. Up to 27,000, I think, is the record in one day. Coming on board for that. But through that experience, we get the opportunity to share the gospel, whether it's through the written form or one-on-one through a conversation. They're able to be introduced to Jesus through meeting somebody or through the literature that will be given out freely to them when they come on board. That's what happens on board. We have teams going out that get involved in ministry in prisons and schools and hospitals, on the streets. We work with the local church, putting the church back at the center and saying, we want to come along and be a catalyst in your city to help reach your city, but also part of our vision is to share the vision for global mission with them, that they will also get involved in sending their people overseas and outside their country.
I'm sure it's different from country to country, but what's the reception like? Do you have difficulty getting into these ports at all?
Sure, some ports are more challenging than others, but I don't know of any other ministry that gets the open door into countries like Libya, like countries in the Middle East, and I was on board when we went into places like Myanmar, Vietnam, China, and these are in recent years, and so it's and we have obviously take care when we go in there and uphold the government regulations, but our desire is just to simply be an example and live out Jesus in those environments.
Yeah, give me the scope of what you do. I know it starts with the books; those have always been important.
Sure,
but it goes way beyond that. Doesn't it?
Sure. There's the books, and that's, as I mentioned, sort of one of the platforms that we can get in on. But when you have 400 believers followers of Jesus coming into a port, and one of the things that we never talk about, but I think often, is the prayer that's happening for those from the families of those and the churches of those 400 people around the world for that port as a result of that. But going out, linking with the churches, supporting the churches, coming alongside them in their efforts to reach their local community. That's a big part of what we want to do. And as I said, seeking to engage them in the nations, both locally and globally. We also get involved in relief work in ports. I wouldn't say it's a large part of what we do, but it is part of what we do, seeking to alleviate some of the suffering in ports.
The needs are so great.
When we spend so much of our time in the global south of the developing world, it's certainly a lot of those needs coming face to face. So evangelism, mobilizing, these relief efforts. And of course, there's this thing that's going on the whole time on board the ship for the 2 years that people are on board, is this training and the developing of the people on board, so that when they leave, they're folks that are ready to go out and minister in whatever environment God puts them in.
So is the ship a launching pad then for many of the missionaries, the 6,100 missionaries that serve with OM?
Absolutely. Over the years, it's become it has become just that. We have, myself, my own personal story, as you've heard, is 7 years on board the ship, which has led me today to be the president here in the U.S. Of OM. And that's true for many throughout the OM world. There's two real launching pads, I think, as we look at our story, and we often joke about this, is that India, that was your rite of passage, and often in the early days had you spent time in India? That was a really hard place. Or the ships.
Yeah.
It was and we were nearly second class because it wasn't really as hard as India. But a lot of OMers today have experienced one of those two places, for sure.
I'm sure the issues of community really come to the forefront when you're living together on a ship like that. Yeah. Well, you learn a lot, don't you?
Absolutely. Well, you think of, college is something similar in that you go and you spend 4 years with people.
Yeah, but you can get away.
Exactly. And on the ship, you go to your bedroom and it's literally inches away from, 4 other people across the wall, and you eat breakfast and dinner and supper with those people. You worship with them, you pray with them, you work with them. And it's 130 meters of metal that's 400 people crammed into that. So it is very intense, but the friendships that people make in that time are some of the best friendships that they'll ever make in their life.
And you had a family on board with you.
Yeah.
What's it like to have children and raise your kids that way?
I've often said, Wayne, that there was no better place to raise my family. We had 400 aunts and uncles for our kids who just loved to, they were missing their own little nieces and nephews, brothers and sisters, and they just loved to take care of them and babysit. Of course, the exposure to the many different cultures. Their geography lesson wasn't in a book; it was on the streets of a city every port. So it was a wonderful environment spiritually, and even just in many practical ways to bring up our children.
Mm-hmm. Has to be very expensive to operate a ship on the world's oceans and do what you do.
There is certainly a big price tag to it, but when I compare that to maybe what we're spending in the U.S. on our churches, it actually pales, because there's very few churches, there's very few ministries actually that could see 1 million people come in contact with 1 million different people every year.
Coming to you.
Coming to us, yeah. And doesn't even include the people we go out to meet, but 1 million people coming up our gangway every year that will receive the gospel. And I think whenever you take all of that into consideration, it's not as expensive as it may first of all seem, yeah.
I hope we'll get a chance to talk more about this, but let's talk about some of the other ministries of OM. 118 nations you mentioned.
Yeah.
Some of those we can't even talk about because they're very sensitive areas of the world, aren't they?
Sure. Yeah, we have work right across the world and in focusing on a number of key areas. For example, our whole work among the Muslim world, which we have within 50 different countries, reaching out just with the love of God to Muslims and trying to befriend them and bring them into that knowledge of Jesus. But whenever I look at the OM world, actually it's changed quite a bit over the landscape has changed quite a bit for us. Of course, the world is changing. The reality is there are more unreached in the world today than there was yesterday.
Yeah, people don't understand that.
Yeah. It just seems to be about a year ago we were talking about 1.7 billion. Today we're talking about 2 billion. It's just growing rapidly, and so things have to radically change in how we are reaching out.
So give me an example. What's changed?
Well, of course, take the whole thing of access into countries. Today it's harder and harder to get visas into countries as in the traditional missionary style, but there are opportunities now to send professionals into those countries that are going to go in with not in the old tent-making model where you go in and you do your job from 9 to 5 and then rush home to do the ministry aspect, but they're actually going to be seeing their job as their ministry.
Fully integrated.
Absolutely. This taking away the sacred secular divide. Yes. But of course, technology. Yeah. I mean, we don't have to smuggle caseloads of literature into a country anymore.
What a gift.
It can be passed through with exponentially greater ways than we've ever seen before. Yeah.
What a delight to meet Andrew Scott today. We've heard just a small part of everything that Operation Mobilization does to proclaim the gospel in many ways and in many places all over the world. With over 6,000 workers from 100 nations serving in well over 100 nations, the story of OM is amazing and deserving of our support. To learn more about OM's mission, including the upcoming Freedom Climb to support women and children enslaved and oppressed around the world, please visit our website, firstpersoninterview.com. You'll find links there that will provide much more information and action steps that you can take to support this ministry on behalf of Christ and His kingdom. That's firstpersoninterview.com. And if you'd like to pass along the link to today's interview to someone else or listen to any past First Person interview, use the same website, firstpersoninterview.com. And I hope you'll follow us on Facebook as well. You can see what's coming up on the program and interact with other listeners. You'll find us easily at facebook.com/firstpersoninterview. Well, next week when you join us, our guest will be Melinda Delahoyd of CareNet, a Christ-centered abortion prevention ministry. I hope you'll join us next week at the same time. Now, with thanks to my friend and producer Joe Carlson, I'm Wayne Shepherd. Join us next week for First Person.